So today's material is a little different in that I'm going to introduce the library provisions of 108, which are only glancingly referenced in the casebook text. They're a great source of statutory complexity. The aim here is for you to understand the kinds of things that you'd need to look up and make decisions on in answering a specific question, and also just to wade into some of the really gnarly details of why the Copyright Act is as long as it now is. There are two key issues. The first is different treatment of different rights. Here we are focused on reproduction and distribution rights. Display and performance rights are not covered by 108. Second, we get different treatment of different users and uses. Whereas reproduction and distribution rights are broad, encompassing many situations, even ones we haven't yet thought up, the exceptions are narrow and differ in many of their requirements. Both factors play a role in the resulting complexity. So up here is the beginning of the statutory provision. It allows reproduction and distribution of no more than one copy under certain circumstances. It's what makes the library able to get physical copies of articles for you if you've ever used it for that purpose, although you will soon see that there are limits on this. So let me ask an initial question. Would this provision cover making one copy of one article for one patron, and then 2 years later making one more copy of the same article for a different patron? So you can see the initial language is no more than one copy. Does it cover that situation? You actually have to wait for an answer to that one. Hopefully we'll get one. We also have special rules for preservation copies of unpublished works. You can make up to 3 copies for this special preservation purpose. Can works that are duplicated solely for preservation and security be lent out to patrons? No, they cannot. So even if preservation is preservation against patrons' wear and tear, you can't lend out the copies. A question to consider, given the RAM copy doctrine, how useful is this provision for reproduction in digital format? How would you even count how many libraries the copy made in digital format, given how computers work? Further, even if you can make digital versions, they can't be made available outside the premises. So ultimately, Congress decides that a little more is necessary, though not a lot. Next part, replacement of deteriorating, damaged, or obsolete copies for published works. Can the library lend the physical copies of these that it makes to patrons? And the answer here is yes, if they are not digital copies. But you have to keep reading. It turns out that there's a limit on 108A, allowing the copying of no more than one article. The limit is provided by D&E. You get to make patrons a copy of one article or other contribution to a collection or periodical, or a small part of any other work, as long as the copy becomes the patron's property for private use, and as long as you tell the patrons about copyright. Also, you can only copy a whole work for patrons under limited circumstances. Copies have to be unavailable at a fair price. And there is a savings clause. It has 2 secondary liability provisions, 1 provision for fair use, and 1 really weird cross-reference. First, the library has no liability for unsupervised copying machines as long as they bear warning notices about copyright. Doesn't matter whether patrons infringe. Second, the library's own immunity does not affect whether the patron infringed. Fourth, fair use and contracts are unaffected by this provision. If fair use allows you to do more, you can do more. If contracts require you to do less, you can't exercise your full statutory rights. And third, reproduction and distribution by lending of a limited number of copies and extras of audiovisual news subject to A1, 2, and 3. What on earth does this mean? First of all, note the limit to lending. 108D and E are about transferring title of copies, while this provision is about not transferring title of copies. Now, can a library make a full copy of an audiovisual news program under this provision? Yes, it can. Does the library first have to have an authorized copy in its possession? No, it does not, making this unlike the other provisions. This apparently allows recording off of a stream, which is indeed what it's used for. And once again, we get a vague term. A limited numbers of such lending copies are allowed. Then at long last, we get the answer to the question about making the same copies of the same article 2 years apart to 2 different patrons. They can actually, in fact, be 2 days apart. or 2 hours apart, as long as the library has no reason to believe that the requests are related or correlated. We have 2 separate subsections here. Part 1 is relatively easy to understand, and it targets related or concerted reproductions. So a professor who wanted students to get copies of the textbook or even copies of a particular article without paying. That seems fairly straightforward. You might reasonably wonder, what extra does section 2 add? Wouldn't any systematic reproduction also be related or concerted, since those are the key words in the different provisions? And the cross-reference to subsection D is your key in understanding what this means. For the periodicals described in part D, there might be something that is systematic without being related or concerted. So if people are asking for different articles from the journal Cell in an uncoordinated way, it is possible that at some point the overall effect is to substitute for the library's own subscription to Cell, even if no single article gets copied many times. Thus, for periodicals, there's this extra limit. There is no law interpreting these provisions, by the way. Librarians just have to figure out what they mean. And then finally, the most recently added, and not unconnectedly, one of the longest of the provisions. It was mentioned in Eldred as one of the limits balancing the cost of the 20-year term extension to life plus 70. Essentially, libraries can make copies of otherwise unavailable works in the last 20 years of their term. Indeed, it can reproduce, distribute, display, or perform such works for preservation, scholarship, or research. So you can see actually it's broader, and it does get into some of the other rights, whereas the rest of the provisions don't. There is no right to make derivative works, though, and there's no right if the work is subject to normal commercial exploitation or if copies can be obtained at a reasonable price. Normal commercial exploitation seems to include it's being broadcast and streamed but not sold in copies, which does create some access challenges. There's also no right to use this provision if the copyright owner files a notice that either there is normal commercial exploitation or that copies are available at a reasonable price. Also, this provision doesn't apply to subsequent uses by users. You might ask, what does that mean that a user who gets a copy of such a work under this provision can't distribute it to someone else by sale or lending? And the answer is no. Such a copy is lawfully made. It's lawfully made under 108H, and thus first sale attaches to it. So what this really means is that there's no right for users to engage in further reproductions, even if the library is entitled to make the reproductions. And again, you can consider the potential effect of the RAM copy doctrine on digital copies. If there's really no right to make additional copies, then digital copies become problematic. When I sync my computer to Dropbox, making another copy of the work I got from my library, I'm not protected by 108H. Finally, it turns out there are even more limits than you thought. Reproduction and distribution rights don't apply to musical works, PGS works, and audio-visual works that aren't about news, except that musical works, etc., are subject to the rules for preservation copies, replacing damaged copies, and the last 20 years of the term. And PGS works, pictorial and graphic works can be copied if they are illustrations or other adjuncts to works copied for patrons under D&E. Basically, what this means is you can't copy a musical work, etc., under D&E. And you can consider what the rationale for those limits might be. And with that, so we will not cover this in great detail in class, but I thought it was important to walk through a provision like this to show you what some of the key parts of the Copyright Act look like. Not anywhere near as glamorous as fair use or even, the basic list of the 106 rights, but super, super important.